All right, everyone, I'm going to invite you to get to your seats for the next exciting installment of the Surge meeting. You know, it's always challenging to have the mid-afternoon slot after people have had their cookies and stuff like that. This is kind of like the, I think of it as the death spot. So I'll try to keep it entertaining, but I appreciate if you have some trouble fixating on this. So what I'm going to be talking about over the next 20 minutes or so is how the secretaries, or the discretionary, or whatever we're calling it, today's Advisory Committee on Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children, considers conditions for newborn screening. So how do they go from the evidence reviews to making decisions. And I neglected, on my next slide, I left off all the hundreds of people that helped me on this project, and so I regret that I did that, but know that it really takes a village to put together these evidence reports. So we've really made an evolution from the traditional screening criteria, those that were first promulgated by the World Health Organization in the 1960s, written up by Wilson and Youngner, but still really at the core, a lot of these are still considered. So in order for something to be strongly considered as something good to screen for, you have to have a condition that's an important health problem. Obviously, if something's not an important health problem, what's the reason for detecting it? But when you try to tease that apart by what we mean by important, something can be important because it can have a devastating course, but be rare, or maybe be less devastating but more common. So it's really kind of hard to unpack what we mean by importance, and I'm going to be talking about that a little bit more as we go through. Traditionally, the natural history has to be understood, and that's important because if you want to evaluate whether or not you're making a difference, you need to know something about how the disease course unfolds. I, though, hate this notion of natural history, because once we identify a condition, there's nothing really natural about the history anymore. Even if we're not entirely sure how to treat it, we do something. There has to be a latent or an early symptomatic stage of the condition, because otherwise you don't need to screen. If there's no way to detect it before it becomes clinically obvious, then screening's not going to work. There has to be a test out there that's easy, acceptable, accurate, and reliable. And of course, unpacking what these terms mean is very difficult. We're going to be talking about this some more. There has to be a treatment that's accepted and more effective if started early. So if there's no benefit from early intervention, what's the use of detecting it early? Again, we're going to go back and reconsider what we mean by treatment. And finally, from the Wilson-Youngner criteria, diagnostic and treatment have to be cost effective. And of course, this is difficult too, because whose costs and whose efficacy are we talking about? So although it's been some 50 years or so since these Wilson-Youngner criteria first came out, I think we're really still struggling with what they mean and how to apply that to policy. So let's talk a little bit about the Advisory Committee. So the Advisory Committee provides guidance to the Secretary of Health and Human Services about the conditions that should be included in newborn screening. So the Advisory Committee does not speak to states, and this is an important nuance to remember. The Advisory Committee talks to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. It's then up to the Secretary about whether or not conditions become part of the recommended universal or uniform screening panel, the so-called RUSP. But even still, remember that most newborn screening programs are operated at the state level. Most of them do have to follow the RUSP, and there's also some nuance now with the Affordable Care Act, in that the things that are recommended by the Secretary for inclusion in newborn screening are supposed to be covered by the Affordable Care Act. And figuring out exactly what that means is difficult, and I hope that our next speaker can maybe illuminate what that means exactly, because I'm not sure. So in terms of the evolution of the recommended uniform screening panel, in 2006, that's when the American College of Medical Genetics developed a report that recommended the 29 core conditions based largely on expert panels and voting around conditions and so forth. But since then, the advisory committee has adopted a separate evidence-based approach, which was based on very traditional evidence review reports, and that is what led to the recommendations to add SCID and critical congenital heart disease to the recommended uniform screening panel. And during the time of this earlier process, there were recommendations against adding in hemoglobin H disease, Krabbe disease, neonatal hyperbilirubinemia, and Pompe disease. I think, again, evaluating these rare conditions is difficult. I think it's fair to say that it's figuring out how best to do it is a work in progress. But what really came through in the process that was missing from this is really this assessment of the capability of states to screen. What does it really mean? What's the impact on the states as recommendations come out? The other thing, which was less of a big issue, I think, to the general community, but I think in terms of understanding the impact of recommendations, another thing that was missing is this good assessment about the bounds of benefit and harm. So if you were to adopt screening, how many extra cases would you detect and at what risk to the screen population? So that's added in there. This new process was adopted in, I'd say February 2012. It was probably really February 2013. So I was off by a year. Again, as Dr. Bocchini mentioned earlier, the condition review process is now based on 3 reports. There's a systematic evidence review, and so this is very similar to what we were doing before, where we shook all the trees and picked up every rock to look for whatever evidence is out there, as well as interviewing experts to look for important unpublished data. The evidence review process is fairly unique in that, unlike other evidence review bodies, we consider levels of evidence that are usually dismissed, things like small case series or case studies and those kinds of things. But I think it's critically important because what we're talking about here are rare conditions, and if we were to dismiss that body of literature, although it would make our work a lot easier, I think it would give a really incomplete picture of what's going on. The second thing is the assessment of the bounds of benefit and harm, and that's chiefly done by my good friend and colleague at the University of Michigan, Lisa Prosser, who's a decision analyst, and she comes up with these really cool models and stuff like that. And then the third thing is the evaluation of the capabilities of states to implement comprehensive screening, and that's a work product that's principally done by the Association of Public Health Laboratories, and Jalili Ojudu, who I think many of you know. I think everybody knows Jalili, right? Leads those and is a regular participant on the calls that we have. So how does the advisory committee take these streams of evidence to make a decision? It's difficult to do, but there needs to be a transparent process so that people can understand where this came from. And so in April of last year, we had a meeting to redefine the decision matrix and have separated things into, first, the certainty of net benefit. So if by net benefit, I mean, if you were to imagine the benefit and subtract off the harms and some sort of, think about that at a 30,000 foot level, does the benefit outweigh the harms, and how certain are you of that? So it's really kind of two things to consider. And I think, as everyone knows, there's often incomplete information around the benefit of screening, and harms of screening are rarely reported. And so it's a difficult thing to do, but it's the role of the advisory committee, so not me. I don't sit at the big table and vote. I'm back at the little kids' table, so to speak. It's broken down into these categories. So an A would be high certainty of that adoption of screening for whatever the targeted condition would lead to significant net benefit. So you think that there's a significant net benefit and you're highly certain of it. B would be moderate certainty, and by moderate we mean that additional studies could actually change the direction. But a moderate certainty that adoption of the screening for the targeted condition would lead to significant net benefit. So you think that there's a net benefit there, but there's sort of more wiggle room in there. A C would be high or moderate certainty that adoption of the screening for the targeted condition would lead to zero or small net benefit. That's where the juice isn't worth the squeeze, as we say in North Carolina. A D would be high or moderate certainty that adoption of screening for the target condition would lead to a negative net benefit. So this is that screening would lead to more harm than benefit. And an L is just there's insufficient evidence to even begin to guess about the net benefit. Okay, so there are obviously a lot of personal values that come into this, and this is why you need to have a body like the advisory committee to take the evidence and translate it into these things. Related to this, though, are issues related about the state's capability to screen for the condition, and this we've broken down into 4 things. Number 1 would be screening for the targeted condition has high to moderate feasibility, and most newborn screening programs are ready for comprehensive screening. So this is something that could be done, and most programs within the next year or 2 could, throw the switch and start doing it. 2 would be screening for the targeted condition has high to moderate feasibility, so this is something that could be done. And most newborn screening programs have what we term developmental readiness for comprehensive screening. And the word I skipped over there is comprehensive screening. So when I think about screening, I'm not thinking about just the application of the test, but I'm thinking of the whole thing from soup to nuts, right? From the time that you initiate screening to diagnostic follow-up to getting the newborns into systems of care for long-term follow-up. So 2 would be that it's high to moderate feasibility, and most newborn screening programs have developmental readiness. And developmental readiness, we just operationalized this is within the next 3 years. I think 3 is not the magic number. Dr. Bocchini, I'm looking at him. And 3 would be high to moderate feasibility, and most newborn screening programs are unprepared, so that a lot more work would be required to begin screening. And a 4 would be screening for the target condition has low feasibility, and that means that even if you wanted to screen for it, there are fundamental things related to the laboratory or diagnostic follow-up or the availability of treatment. Any of those links along the chain that it just couldn't be done. Okay, so people with me so far in terms of the evidence side of things and the capability.
Or are we talking about technical manpower feasibility? What does feasibility mean?
Yeah, so that's, feasibility is, I appreciate that unpacking feasibility, we could actually do that for the next hour as well. So feasibility means, the way that we operationalize it, we have a manuscript that's coming out in Genetics and Medicine, I think any moment now, about this. Feasibility addresses that relative to the other things that health departments need to do that they could do. I mean, more money is going to need to come into play for anything, or I shouldn't say for anything, for most things that are going to be adopted, unless this is maybe just adding something else to tandem mass spec that's already there. All these things are going to cost money. There's going to be no ability to do things without money. What we can't do within our group is project out exactly how much everything is going to cost to do, but it's the role, and maybe I'll put Dr. Matern and Dr. Bocchini on the hot seat after I'm done, but that's one of the things that they have to weigh as they come to the issue of feasibility. I appreciate that I didn't directly answer your question, but I. The rest of the room. But I mean, and I'm gonna let me keep going because I'm going to address this issue of cost some more. So, this is the way that things fall out into the decision matrix. So, look first. Start on the left-hand side, right? We have the net benefit. which was broken down into significant net benefits. So you think that, oh, I got to race fast now. You stole some of my time, man. Yeah, because they're waving the sign at me. Oh, she gave you a 0. All right, so you can imagine that the things break down into significant benefit, 0 to net, 0 to small benefit, and negative benefit. We have feasibility over here, and it breaks out into a score. Things that are in the top column, the A1s, A2s, A3s, those are the things that are sort of primed for recommendations. What the numbers help the advisory committee do is be nuanced in their recommendation to the secretary about, what's the timeline for adopting it and what do states need to be able to implement it. So if, you really think that something would be beneficial, but it's going to cost a lot of resources, then that's something that the advisory committee can put in their recommendation to the secretary. And that's what happened with Pompe disease. I just want to keep marching on in the next few minutes. So what about cost benefits? This gets to some of your stuff. So, oftentimes people talk about costs like they're harms. They're not, right? We all choose, what we're going to spend money on. But we need to think about whose costs. Harms are difficult to evaluate, and especially with issues of like false positives, right? Not all false positives are created equal. If you test positive for congenital hypothyroidism and it's just a matter of sending another blood spot and you rule it out, it's like no big deal. But if you have a condition where you need to bring in a baby to see a specialist to get things evaluated, that's a different kind of false positive. Early detection could be a benefit or a harm depending upon where you sit and what you're going to do with the findings and sort of what perspective you take on things. It's not only a matter of looking at treatment efficacy, but effectiveness in the real world, and that gets to how onerous the therapy is, plus the accessibility. So there may be a great treatment for a specific condition, but if you need to get regular, infusions and you live far away from a treatment center that can do it well, that's something that needs to be considered. This gets, I think, to one of your questions too. Should there be a specific metric with a threshold that things could be boiled down into? So, you put everything into a computer and you end up with a number of 7, and if 7 is below 10, then you say no, that kind of thing. That's never going to happen. These issues are too nuanced. So it's always going to involve people grappling with difficult issues. These are all sorts of challenges that everyone here knows about, but I'm going to say them anyway. What if screening might be a benefit to the family, but not necessarily to child? What if screening might not benefit the individual until much later in life? That's the early detection of late onset disease. How should net benefit to the individual versus society be weighed? So there are a few people that get benefit from it a lot, but a greater population that wouldn't benefit or maybe be exposed to some harm. What do you do about that? What about the need to identify cases to develop or assess interventions, right? For a lot of these conditions, if you don't screen, you won't identify the cases to evaluate whether or not treatment's effective. I think that's one of the great things about the National Newborn Screening Translational Research Network, that they're going to help resolve some of these issues. I'm looking for Mike Whiteson, but I don't see him in the room right now. There's Pompe disease. I'm going to, in the interest of time, because there's some other things I want to talk about, and I know that I'm going to get a question about Pompe disease, but let me suffice it to say that I think that looking at it, it was like an A2, A3, and Dr. Bocchini can talk about how this was couched to the secretary. The key issue with it here is that there are it affects about 1 in 28,000 or so babies, but most of the babies that are going to be identified through newborn screening are going to have late onset disease, and so that creates a challenge about when to begin therapy for those individuals with late onset disease, and what does that even mean for a newborn screening program. Let's see, I'm going to skip this because I'm just talking, that slide I got my magic wand there. So what I want to remind everyone is that newborn screening is one of the great public health achievements, which is now almost 50 years old. It's going to look a lot different over the next decade in terms of where tests are administered, like point of service testing and that kind of thing. There are new opportunities for to challenge the old screening paradigms. And the key thing here is that the only way to know whether or not we're doing the right thing and to inform the process as we move forward is to collect data, and we really need to think about how that's done. And I know that my good colleague over there, Dr. Sontag, that's something that she thinks a lot about. So I have some other things that I can talk about, but I'm about to get to 0, so I'm going to stop right there. And do you think, okay, he's saying that I can still go. Can I just, this is my parting thought, okay? Does everyone know what that is on the left? Have people heard me talk about the Brooklyn Bridge, right? So the Brooklyn Bridge was built in, I think, 1883. It was designed by this guy named Roebling. And it's a suspension bridge. And when he built it, everyone was afraid to go on it because they thought there's no way that a suspension bridge like this is going to work. But what, his real genius was that he put in these girders and stays, all these wires and stuff like that. And it, he built this like really amazing suspension bridge. After he built this, as a matter of fact, they had P.T. Barnum marched elephants across it because people were so afraid of it, and to show that it would work. And for a long time, I mean, this really changed how bridges were built, and people knew about the need to, how you need to design them and reinforce them and stuff like that. But what happened over time is that people wanted to like save money and also make them look more modern, something that like Steve Jobs might want to do. And so they started taking out elements and making them sleeker, and that's where you get, does people know what that is? Anybody know what that is? All right, anybody else know? So this is the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, which was put up in the 1940s or 50s. I can't remember right off the top of my head, but around then. And right after they built it, the wind picked up and the whole thing collapsed. And at the time, people were like, how could this have happened? We're going to rebuild, and they were kind of beating their chests over it and stuff like that. What they had done was they got rid of all the stuff. You can see there's no like girders and stays and stuff like that, all the stuff that made the bridge work, right? And so they kind of like forgot. They lost, I know, -2, but my bridge story. So the whole thing fell apart because people weren't thinking about what you need to do to make something that could last. And I think about this with newborn screening. It takes a lot of money and infrastructure, and sometimes you wonder, like, where are we going with all this stuff, and can it just work anyway? And what I want people to remember is that we want to stay like the Brooklyn Bridge and not be like the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, but it's very easy for us to fall into that. And so that we need to, it's, I think, incumbent upon this group to think about this kind of stuff. And even though, some of this like data collection stuff like that may seem like onerous and why we're spending all this time to do it, I think it's really, I want you to remember the Brooklyn Bridge and not be disasters like, okay, let's see how good everyone is, and I promise I'll stop. All right, what's that disaster on the left? Challenger. Okay, the one everyone misses down there? Chernobyl. Yeah, that's Chernobyl. And then the Titanic, and I fear about healthcare. Okay.